outside world would make of this debate. I haven't been to a York Synod for about 15 years, and I couldn't believe how unrealistic it seemed. I'm sorry. I mean, how could this arcane stuff make any sense to the outside world?
I mean, I think most people in the arcane stuff are very well aware of that. You've got to remember that a vast proportion of the people there are clergy who are dealing with the outside world the whole time, the outside world as you call it. But we have to go through a process of changing the way in which we work. We've made some significant progress on that over the last 3 days. The mood at this was infinitely better than last November. The facilitated discussions were enormously helpful, have made a very big difference to the culture, and that's the beginning of trying to get this whole way of doing things into something that makes a bit more sense. As to the content of the debate, it's one that's going on right around the world, and it's one we've got to deal with.
But if I may say so, the facilitated discussions haven't made any difference to the votes.
You have no idea of that.
I can count.
Well, you can count, but you don't know what they would have been without the facilitated discussions. And what they have done is they've shifted the way in which people are talking to each other so that option 4, for example, as a result of the facilitated discussions, which is the kind of option we were going towards last year, simply had no legs in it at all. That is a huge change from where we were. You don't just compare raw votes. If you want to do a proper analysis, you have to compare both the mood and the content of the measure last autumn with where we are today.
Archbishop, some of the votes representing the more conservative view were very close and showed a long way off the 2/3 majority that will be required at final approval. I mean, some people have compared this to just changing tracks on a road path to a train crash. My colleague here, John, did that. And I just wonder, do you think that it's realistically possible to get it through, even with this new post-role play mood?
It's certainly, yes, you're quite right. There's not 2/3 in each house, that's absolutely clear. There's a strong desire to get it done. We aren't at the stage of saying, should we ordain women as bishops? We're at the stage of saying, we do ordain women, we're going to ordain women as bishops. How do we go about that? That's a move. I don't know, it's going to take a little while. We're going to have to go on working at it. There's been such a shift in mood over the last 6 months that as ever I remain extremely optimistic.
You said in your speech the other day, you spoke about the need for transparency, and including in the context of the possibility that there might ultimately be people who might not feel they can stay within the church. Could you say a little bit more about what you meant by that? And,
I'm not sure I quite understand the question. So if you tell me what the question means, I'll try and explain my answer.
Will there come a time when the church has to admit that full compromise isn't possible, and that some people may have to sort of like it or lump it?
It's a very good question. Obviously, I hope not. But it's possible. There's simply no way of telling. I think the accurate answer is I have no idea what the answer is to that question. I certainly believe that there is a reasonable way of going forward, particularly using this sort of electrified ring-fence process, which should give people enough assurance of provision to be able to stay within the church and continue to work within the church. People don't change that easily, you know, and when they do, they often drift back.
Steve?
Archbishop, do you think there's a serious chance that should this process fail, Parliament will act to force the Church's hand?
Oh, I have no idea. That's totally hypothetical. The question started with Nick.
Hints of it in November and hints of it ever since.
Who knows?
Archbishop, quite apart from the 2/3 majority each house issue, what do you feel about the final result on the motion? 319 to 84 and 22 abstentions. That's considerable.
I think it shows that there is very strong support for the principle of ordaining women as bishops. I think that it doesn't tell us anything about what was in the voting in the houses. And I think it says we're on the beginning of a journey and we have to keep working very hard at it. Talking to David Porter afterwards, he was pleased, but I think we've both had far too much experience of this sort of thing to be anything other than quite realistic. He quoted to me one of the Northern Ireland ministers, who you may, John, be able to say who it was, but who, when asked at one point, was he optimistic? He said, "I'm never optimistic, but I'm always hopeful."
Yeah. Just to supplement, you said this was the beginning of a journey. Well, actually, we've been on this journey for quite a long time.
Yes, that's a very accurate correction. This is not the beginning of a journey, this is the next stage. We came to a grinding halt last November. We've got some momentum back into the process. You're absolutely right. This is actually a journey that's been going on for far longer than I've been ordained. Quite right. Thank you.
Liz.
Was your recent meeting with Pope Francis fruitful, and do you think his papacy could signal a new era for ecumenical relations with the Catholic Church?
Yes, the meeting was immensely fruitful. There's particularly one initiative that will come out of it, and we're working very hard on, but confidentially at the moment, afraid, but very exciting. We got on. There was a huge sense of excitement in the meeting and in the Vatican, and among everyone you talked to there, a real buzz about the place, and a sense of there is a change coming. I mean, people have compared him to John the 23rd, and I think that's, there's a sense of, here's someone who, to go back to Andrew's very absent question, connects with the real world very well.
Archbishop, having just come back from the Middle East, is there anything you could say about Egypt or Syria and what's happening in those trouble-torn countries at the moment?
I mean, how many people? There was 40 people were killed in Egypt last night. I mean, there's no words that can express how horrendous Syria is. There's just, what can one say when not far short of 100,000 people have now been killed? Egypt, I was meeting some Syrian Christians earlier today, Christian leaders from Syria, and it's interesting that they followed the pattern that I've had over the last few weeks and had in the Middle East with the Syrians in Jerusalem and in Egypt, and the other Christians saying, why are we wanting to import weapons or supply weapons to the rebels? And they see that as a very dangerous move from the Christian context. I'm not qualified to make judgments on the Middle East. All I can see is what I've experienced, or all I can know is what I've experienced. In one of the meetings I had in Egypt, there was a reception in the evening. I wrote about it in the Church Times last week. The sense of fear was extraordinary. A really profound sense of foreboding, both from very, very senior Muslim leaders and very senior Christian leaders. And we just hope and pray that it doesn't degenerate.
And the head of the Coptic Church, we're hopeful, will be addressing Synod.
The head of the Coptic Church in England, in the UK, His Grace Bishop Angelios, will be addressing us, we hope, tomorrow, and speaks. I mean, he is Egyptian, Coptic Egyptian.
Sam.
So, Archbishop, to move on to a different kind of revolution, you said in your first presidential address that there was a revolution in sexuality going on, and the debate over same-sex marriage had revealed how out of step the church appeared to be with mainstream society, for want of a better word. You also said after that there'd be no change in the church's position on same-sex marriage.
I didn't say that. I said I'm not proposing a change in policy.
Right.
It's different from saying there will not be a change. I mean, I can't predict what the church can do.
You're not minded at
there are no proposals at the moment, and I've no reason to think there will be. I'm simply saying I was not making a proposal. I wasn't commenting on what others might do.
Sure, but how does the church tackle that, the chasm between mainstream thinking on sexuality and the church teaching, if you recognise that the church is very out of step, how do you get back in step with society?
With great difficulty. There are elements where we've always been out of step with society. I mean, I heard slightly in my ear my grandmother's voice when I made, if you remember, I didn't say it was just a revolution in sexuality, I said it was on a number of things. But when I mentioned sexuality, my grandmother used to say to her grandchildren, you lot think you invented sex in the 1970s. Whereas we knew quite a lot about it in the 1920s. And, you know, I heard that voice in my ear. One can exaggerate the changes. The church has always been out of step to some degree with society from the day when, long before the church, Moses wrote down the words, do not commit adultery. It probably wasn't his most popular bit of work. And it's always been an issue. Part of it will always be out of step because human beings are human beings. We're out of step with ourselves very often, which is why we believe, you know, why we come to Christ, not first to bring a series of commands, but to believe in the grace of God who reaches out to us in forgiveness. So we have to start by talking of forgiveness when we're engaging with society, and talk about our own need for forgiveness, which we did in the abuse case, in the abuse debate, the safeguarding debate, but also the general human need for forgiveness, because none of us get it right. I think we start around forgiveness and grace, rather than about law, and you know, it goes back to the woman caught in adultery, those without sin throw the first stone. Well, I'm not about to throw stones.
Just going back to relations with the Catholic Church, there's obviously a long-standing commitment to, at some point, full visible unity. How high a priority is that for you, and how live a priority is that?
There is an absolute imperative towards full visible unity. There always has been, since the words of Jesus in John chapter 17, which were picked up in one of Pope John Paul's encyclicals, Ut unum sint, that they may be one. And it is, I think you have very high priorities, and it's certainly a very high priority indeed, but it is also a realistic priority. There's a complexity of theological things to work through, which actually we're doing very well on. There's a complexity of things about how you structure the church and who has authority and all that, and who gets ordained, which we have very large gaps on. And there's a complexity of practical working together, which we're rather good at. And I think we need to push on all three of them at the same time. The Roman Catholic Church historically thinks in very long-term ways, as do we quite often. And so, for me, it's a very high imperative to move the process forward and see what God does. It's a gift of this. Unity is a gift of the Holy Spirit, and it's in responding to the Holy Spirit of God working in our hearts and changing our hearts that we are united. And so we go with the wind of the Spirit.
Do you think it's something that could potentially be achieved within the lifetime even of your term of office?
I have no idea. We go with the wind of the Spirit. We listen to, you know, the Pope was, there is a very obvious change in atmosphere since the days when Fisher first visited the Pope, back in the 50s, and then Ramsey, and so on and so forth. My predecessor, Rowan Williams, changed the whole pace and tenor of relations between the churches. And I think that momentum is continuing. It's good. We're making good progress. We're walking together, carrying the burdens of disagreement, rather than walking separately and carrying the burdens of disagreement.
The survivors yesterday said that there could be a need for a Treason reconciliation, or a sort of a public inquiry. So I just wondered if you had thoughts on whether that's likely to happen.
My key thought is what I tried to say yesterday afternoon in that incredibly painful debate, which was that the thing we must not do is tell survivors how we are going to deal with that, because we've spent the last 30 or 40 years doing that, longer probably. And we actually, what kind of way we have to give confidence that the church is listening to them, paying attention to them and responding to them is something that has to be very much driven by them rather than by us. So I don't want to prejudge what they will say and the kind of structure that they would want.
Last one, I think.
I'm all right.
Okay.
Sorry, can
I can tell you lot out.
I want to come back with one more of these real-world questions, because you said the clergy do...
You've only
live
had one so far.
You said the clergy do indeed know what goes on in the real world, and that's my experience too. But in that case, is the problem that the Synod's house of laity is cut off from the rest of the world?
I very much doubt it. I think I'd say, Andrew, what I'd say... I was doing a talk with some diplomats, some British diplomats, recently who work in Africa, and my opening line was to take theology seriously. And I'd say the same to you, that I think a lot of the people in the House of Laity, as in the House of Clergy and House of Bishops, take the theology very seriously. And they may say to themselves, well, we are taking a very different stance to other people, but they believe passionately that this is the right stance, and they would prefer to be faithful to what they see as the position and the call of God, than to tune in to where society is at the moment. And, you know, I may disagree with their position, but I don't actually question their motives.
But the rest of the world would. I mean, if theology is what leads you to take up a position quite indefensible, so much the worse for theology is going to be the answer.
Yeah, it probably is. Yes, it's one of the little difficulties we have to deal with. Yes, I mean, there's no good answer for that.
Any more for any more? Last one.
Well, I'd just like to know, ideally, when would you like to consecrate the first woman bishop?
As soon as possible.
No date in mind?
I've got lots of dates in mind, but I'm not going to And now, I think you all need to gather outside so we can slam the door in your face.
I think there's an outdoor interview now and then back into the